James Power. Welcome to Raspberry Point. Today we're going to talk about world famous PEI oysters. PEI oysters became famous back in 1900 at the World's Fair in Paris, and the judges decided that oysters from Prince Edward Island were the best tasting oysters in the world. Here at Raspberry Point, we've been growing oysters for over 30 years. So we have farms in New London Bay, Hunter River, Rustico Bay, Cove Head. Each of those farms produces an oyster that looks and tastes a little bit different, and those are where the different brands of oysters that you see from our company come from. So you have your oysters, your male and your female oyster. Now as the water warms up and it gets to about 20 degrees Celsius, the male and female get a signal to send their sperm and eggs into the water, and you'll get a baby oyster. Now this baby oyster, for the first 3 weeks of its life, it'll actually swim around, and that's the only time in its life where it actually moves on its own. So it's swimming around and it gets about 3 weeks old and it starts to develop a shell. Once that happens, that oyster is going to look to set on something hard where it's going to spend the rest of its life and be a filter feeder. So what we'll do is we'll take this Chinese hat, we call it, we'll cover it in a really thin layer of cement, and just at the right time, when those oysters are about 3 weeks old and ready to find a home, we'll dip this in that thin layer of cement and we'll hang this in the water. And as those baby oysters are floating by, they'll attach, and that's how we'll catch them. So we'll take these little baby oysters, we'll let them grow on here for a couple of months until they get about the size of your pinky nail. And then we'll put them through what's called a thrasher. And a thrasher will bend these plastic discs and pop those little baby oysters off. Now we have a set of baby oysters. So we'll take those little baby oysters and we can take them, and if we have a tray full of these baby oysters, there's lots of different ways we can grow them. So one of the things that we would do is we would grow them naturally on the seabed. So how we would plant those oysters, basically I would stand on the front of a boat, and as the boat drives up and down our lease, I would basically shake these oysters into the water, let them fall, let them set on the bottom, and when we come back 5 or 7 years later and those oysters have grown from the size of your pinky nail into about 3 inches. And that's when we would harvest them and sell them. So that's one way to do it. One of the ways, we'll use what's called, this is called a SEPA basket. So what we can do with this is we hang these from long lines in the water. So as the tide goes up and down, those oysters would get a chance to feed. But as the tide goes down and they're exposed to the air, that's what kills a lot of the stuff that we don't want to grow on oysters. But the oysters are tough enough to take it. Another thing we use is what's called a Zapco bag. So this bag, basically you would put your oysters in here. What we'll do is we'll put 2 of these side by side hung on a back line. So once every 10 days, we would come by and we would flip one on top of the other. Before the ice comes in December, we have to remove all these bags and take all those oysters in before the ice comes in. And then in the spring, when the ice goes, we have to go back, reinstall that entire farm. So what we started using was something called, this is called an oyster grow cage. One of the big bonuses of this is in the wintertime when the ice is coming in, what we can do is we can remove these caps, let the pontoons fill with water, and we can sink this entire cage right to the bottom. And it's protected from all the weather that's happening. And then in the springtime, you can pull this up and you're right back growing. When we harvest the oysters, what it will do is it will use hydraulic crane to lift these out of the water, and then each of these bags is manually dumped by hand. Someone would pull these bags out, open them up, dump them in. On a good day, we would harvest maybe 150,000 oysters a day. So here we are at our grading facility here in Cimbria, Prince Edward Island. So what we do here is we take all those oysters that we've harvested from the farm, we'll put them through this long line. First, it'll clean it through a tumbler, and that'll pull the mussels off. It'll take the small oysters out. From there, it goes through an inspection line. So we'll have a couple of trained people who will look at each oyster coming by to make sure, you know, it's alive, or if there's 2 oysters stuck together. From there, they'll go into what's called a singulator. That singulator is a long tube that will put all the oysters in line. So they will drop into a spacer. All these spaces that you'll see on the grader, one oyster goes in every one. And what that does is that sends it to the camera. where the camera takes a picture of each oyster. Each oyster gets graded for what shape it is and how long it is. And then as it goes down the line, that's where it will come to the counter. And the counter will knock it into the right pile and count them into 100s for us so that we have all the oysters graded and counted. After we have our oysters all boxed, they're ready to go. They're packed into boxes of 100. PEI oysters are the best oysters in the world, and Raspberry Point produces a lot of them.